Hi, everybody. This is Rob Gavin. I am the courts and legal affairs reporter for the Times Union. Really happy to be here today to get a chance to talk to people. We don't always get that chance because we write a lot of articles, obviously, so you only see us behind a byline, but I'm happy to talk to you today, give my perspective as to what it's been like covering the courts of New York State and the federal government as well, courts during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you might imagine, it's a very different time for everybody, and that definitely includes the criminal justice system, which has been operating in sort of virtual reality, so to speak, for the last 2 months or so. This was something that was unexpected by a lot of people, and that obviously includes the courts. And for us covering it, what does that mean? Well, it means the typical going to a courthouse to cover a trial is not going to be the same. But for me, it was a little bit different because I did cover a murder trial in Troy. This was the James White trial. It was a quadruple homicide case. And that was one of the only cases in the state that was actually still happening. It still went on into early April. So I was still going to court every day. But the pandemic and its effect on even that case was obvious. The typical court setting is what, as you might imagine, if you've never been in a courtroom, is you have jury here, you have people watching here. During this case, because of the pandemic, the jury members were all a few feet apart. The alternates were actually in the gallery, which is the area where you watch trials from, and there was hand sanitizer, and it was the giant elephant in the room, so to speak. And eventually it affected the case because there was a mistrial after a juror came in sick, and that was really my first experience as a reporter covering the pandemic, from just being able to see it. I mean, we hear about it, I'm sure we've all been reading about it, but to actually see the effect on an actual ongoing case, to me, was interesting, particularly because in that case, the jury was out for a while and it still had an effect, which raises, I think, the question a lot of people have of, what's next? And if you look on the website of the Unified Court System of New York State, you will see a lot of plans. You'll see that preliminary hearings for defendants that just started again very recently, and what that is that gives defendants a chance to make their case to not be held. It's something that's very often waived for grand jury action, but grand juries aren't meeting in New York right now. So this is an opportunity for a defense attorney to have a hearing to make the case that their client should not be held without bail, and that's something that came out very recently. There's been a slow expansion of courts virtually over the last month or so. If you go back to actually late March, and what that means is there's been virtual arraignments. I covered a case where there was an extradition where the defendant was live, the defense attorney, the prosecutor were live, but all on video. And the judge as well. And I think that's something that we're going to be getting more and more accustomed to. Same way you talk to people at work over Zoom, people have virtual meetings and video conferences. This is something that we're going to continue to see in the court system going forward. There's no immediate end game for when the courts go back to what we know as normal, what we know as the going into court and everything being as we knew it. I think when it goes back in, when you're going to see, if you listen to, a lot of the words coming from, the chief judge, that's Janet DiFiore, is a lot of things are in the planning, but nothing is actually set. There's no date set. There's no official plan of this is going to happen now and that's going to happen then, as far as the actual reopening of the courts goes. And I don't think they really know. The same way we don't really know in many areas of our lives what's going to happen. I think there's been some talk about people going into courthouses being required to wear masks, less people in the courthouse, possibly people being taken their temperature coming in. I think those are all things that you may want to be expecting. Just actually seeing court live now. How does that happen? I did a story some weeks back about the fact that to actually see a court case, you were unable to do it. It was it was happening virtually. So the defendants, the people who were the actual parties to the case, they were there virtually from their homes, or if you're obviously in the jail, that's where you are as a defendant, or if you're a lawyer, you're either your home or you're in your office. But the public has a right to go into a public courtroom, and there wasn't any means for that to happen without the public going to the actual courthouse, which kind of I thought was a strange twist, because here you have everywhere you see is stay home, stop the spread. And meanwhile, if you wanted to watch a court case, let's say you were a family member, let's say you were someone who had an interest in that case, you had to go out, leave your home, and physically put yourself at risk. And that's just one of the many things where we have seen plans, but for things to go forward where not everything is as you would expect it to be. And I think it becomes more the new normal as we get more and more used to it. But at the same time, a lot of things aren't happening. We're not seeing sentences go out. We're not seeing a lot of things happening. The reason for this is something that I think there, as much as you can plan for something, obviously the majority of this is sort of on the fly. Now I see there's a question that someone had asked, do we think this will be, and pardon me for 1 second so I can get the question. So it says, do you think the way the courts are run will change going forward? I do think you will, because I think whenever you see there's a way to do something in a way that saves money, time, expense, I think you're going to see entities such as the court system do it. It's important to note that video conferencing is not new to the court system. It's been happening at the federal level for years. And we've had, I've actually covered a few of these. We've had many times, for instance, in federal court in Albany, there's a senior judge, Thomas McAvoy, for instance, usually based out of Binghamton. We've had judges based out of Syracuse, and the defendants will appear in Albany court to have their arraignment, have their sentencing, and the judge is in another part of the state. And that's happened long before the coronavirus pandemic. So that's something that did exist, and I think you're going to see where there's potential cost-cutting measures or potential time-saving measures, or the type of things that a court system can look at and say, hey, that's something that maybe we could be helped by this. I think you will see that. I think you will definitely see, for the short term going forward, social distancing in courts. I think you'll definitely see things like people being told to wear masks. I mean, these are secure places to begin with. They're public courthouses, but there's always security to begin with. There's metal detectors going in. And I think the same way that you've seen courts secure themselves from potential dangers that are out there, someone coming in armed, for instance, I think now you're going to see that type of effort, but to make sure that there's nobody who comes into the courthouse potentially with a, some sort of health threat. I mean, it's just the reality of what we are in right now, as opposed to where we were even just a few months ago. I see there's another question here. It says, someone says they should make all events public, like WebEx, where you call in and listen or watch. Well, hey, you won't get an argument from me or probably any court reporter out there. I think there's a lot of people who would love to see the courts just go public, because there's an obvious issue of it. If something is happening in public, what's the difference? And that's an argument which you will get a lot of different points of view. There are people who believe that the courts, cameras in the courtroom could influence a witness's testimony, or they believe that that's not appropriate, and there are, or they don't want to see the jury film. So there are arguments out there. Obviously, someone such as myself would argue that there's a public right to see what's happening, and obviously we want to make sure we can tell you everything that's happening. And really, what better way than to actually show you what's happening so you can see it for yourself, as we see in other types of government. So that is something that I think you may see more and more people wondering is, hey, how come we can't see what's going on? There was a 10-year period in New York where courts were public, and that actually sunsetted, and now it's really up to a judge to decide whether or not that is the case. I see another question coming in. What are the big cases these days that have been affected by this? Every case has been affected by this, because the fact is the courts are not operating as they were. So if you were, for instance, under the new bail reform, defendants were given within 15 days of an arraignment under the discovery. This is really the discovery side of it. And, discovery, what that means, in case anybody doesn't know what that means, that's just the disclosure of evidence, the case that the prosecution has, criminal case. It's something where it's within 15 days of that arraignment, they are now tasked with handing over all their evidence. And that's a lot. There's about 22 different types of documents, including 911 calls, witness statements. There's a lot of parts of that. And this was a huge burden for prosecutors to begin with before this happened. So now you have to do that, and you have to be and not get into your office. So because of that, the court system put a suspension on those requirements. So that's not a requirement for prosecutors. That's not something that they have to do. But so right then and there, that's affecting every single court case that would have affected otherwise. Sentencings have been delayed. High profile, it probably doesn't get much more high profile than Nexium and Keith Raniere. Right now, the Keith Raniere sentencing is in for June 23rd. It was supposed to be May 21st. It was before that supposed to be April 16th. And before that, I believe it was in February. Now, it's not unusual for federal sentencings to get adjourned. That is not unusual. What is unusual is to have a situation where a defense attorney is saying that he or she can't talk to their client. And that's what's happened here, because Raniere, obviously was for the people out there who don't know Keith Raniere is, he was the former head, and probably still is to whatever it exists, of Nexium, which is a cult-like organization, self-help organization, as a claim to which he was convicted of every count at a trial last June of racketeering, sex trafficking, and many other counts that were there. I think it was 7 counts overall. And he's looking at realistically life in prison when he's sentenced by Judge Nicholas Gouralfis at his upcoming sentencing. Now, when there's a sentencing in federal court, defense attorneys and prosecutors will send a recommendation memo to the judge. They'll say, this is why I think my client should get blah, blah, no time, 100 years, I'm exaggerating here, but it's a recommendation. Defense will talk about why the judge should be lenient. The prosecution will basically talk about why this person is deserving of an extremely harsh sentencing. Sometimes they'll say they can be lenient. That will not be the case with Raniere. I can pretty much assure you that. But to give that memo to the judge, a defense attorney needs to meet with their client. They need to speak with their client. Keith Raniere was being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. There was at least one COVID case there. There probably have been more, but at least one that I knew of. And they were not allowing visits between judges and their client. They were not allowing visits between lawyers and their clients. So because of that alone, Raniere could not that could not come in. Now, the judge in this case has said with Raniere that this is the last adjournment. So he's saying one way or another, this sentencing is happening for Raniere, and that there's not going to be any more, any more adjournments, and that it's going to happen one way or another. So if it happens either live or it's going to happen virtually. And the thing to remember that is that this case, there are many victims in that case. So there's going to be a lot of people probably pretty upset if they can't be there in person. But again, that has not been ruled yet, but they're saying it's going to be one way or another. And, so that's something to keep in mind, that sentencing on June 23rd could be virtual. I mean, it could definitely be a situation where in New York City, which is the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic right now, that's a situation where that sentencing could happen with Raniere not in the room, the victims maybe giving their statements from their house, and reporters covering it virtually, which would probably mean in the courthouse in Brooklyn. But it could also be a situation where it happens in court and the judge will have to figure out the social distancing of that. There's also been a lot of cases outside of obviously that case. There's a very recently, remember, Paul Baratano was he was a defendant who was part of the early face of the bail reform, in New York. Very recently, it came out that he was, they had the judge toss the indictment against Baratano, and so he had to reface some new charges. So he was in prison. I'm sorry, he was in jail. Then he was out. Then he was back in, and so I think that case, that indictment got tossed. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is bail reform, discovery reform, the murder trial of James White. These were huge stories. And once the pandemic hit, it's kind of a funny thing. All of a sudden, I'm not going to say nobody cared about them, but you have this huge worldwide event. And I think a lot of people's attention has been elsewhere. And I think that's very natural. But we still cover these things. I will tell you, it was highly unusual to cover a quadruple homicide trial. And normally this would be probably front page news every day. And honestly, most people didn't even notice it was happening, other than the people obviously impacted by the crime, and the families of the victims and defense, and those people, because that's how huge this has been. I've done a lot of stories as well recently on people asking for compassionate release. There's a guy by the name of Alexander Salvagno. His name may ring a bell to some people who've been around the area years ago. He was convicted in the late 1990s of an extremely serious environmental crime. I think it was called at the time the most serious environmental crime in the history of the United States, and was given a very harsh sentence of 25 years. His father was as well. He was an asbestos businessman, and essentially had exposed people, according to the criminal complaint and what he was convicted of, to asbestos, and which is obviously carcinogen and a dangerous thing. He was then asking to be released, and the Judge Khan actually gave him a release. So someone who would never have been out, I mean, he probably had about 9 more years on his sentence, would never have been released, and he's been released. The judge found that there were sufficient reasons to release him. I think you're going to be seeing more and more of this. People asking to be released because of the conditions in prison. There's no way to downplay the fact that many people are very concerned about the conditions in federal and state prisons, because obviously this is a pandemic, and there's been judges who have been very vocal. I believe one federal judge had essentially referred to prisons, whether it's federal or state, as a petri dish, and you're going to see people asking for release. I wrote a story earlier this week. An individual named Thomas Lagan. He's a former financial advisor, former Slingerland's attorney, and he was a business partner of former Guilderland Town Justice Richard Sherwood. People might know him as Dick Sherwood. They both were guilty in this case, and Lagan, who was just pled guilty about 7 months ago. Interesting that there's a way you can avoid doing your time at the state level if you're also convicted in a federal case by reporting to the federal authorities like a day before your sentencing, before you do your state time. That's what Lagan wanted to do because he didn't want to do his time in the state system. He wanted to do his time in the federal system, which is considered easier. Well, 6 months go by, and he ends up being in the MDC in Brooklyn, a federal facility where Keith Raniere is as well, by the way. And Mr. Lagan decided that this is not the place he wants to be and wanted out, and wanted compassionate release, or to be allowed to be released at least for a period of time, or allowed to be home. And he lives now in Cooperstown. The judge said no. So Judge Kahn, same judge that let Salvagno out, said no to Thomas Lagan and said, look, the fact that you're in your 60s and have some health issues and you're a smoker, that's not enough. So we are seeing a difference of cases, but I think you're going to see a lot more of this. You're going to see a lot more people asking for compassionate release. There's this, a big movement of people that really want the prisons to be letting people out and not be in these situations where they're at potential risk of health. That's something that I think is going to continue to come, that we're going to continue to hear. And look, there are people that have been convicted of very serious crimes, violent crimes, murders, rapes, things like that. I think, you're going to see, I think you're going to see people convicted of those crimes asking for a release. I don't think you're going to see many, if any of them, released, but I think you're going to see people ask for that. And I think you're definitely going to see people convicted of white collar crimes asking for compassionate release. Because if you're a defense attorney, why would you not ask that question? Like, why would you not ask? If there's a legitimate risk, if you're seeing people who have committed pretty egregious offenses be let out, I think you're going to see people say, "Hey, look, let me see if I can get out of this." And I think you will see some people who are let out. And there is a public health risk, but I think there's also a risk some people will look at to public safety if you're talking about people who have been convicted of violent or predatory acts. Let's see if we have more questions out here. I think we might have had another one about the courts and the court system and and whatnot. I think as far as how that is going to be handled going forward and whatnot. I mean, one of the things I can tell you is every Monday, Chief Judge Janet Fiore has been giving what I would consider almost like a mini state of the judiciary, which is the state of the court system. And what the Chief Judge has done is she's given you a rundown, and she's been fairly honest about the fact that they're not saying, hey, we're going to be up and running by this date or that date. We're going to be, she said, hey, look, we really don't know. I mean, she's kind of at times actually said, we're just going to be very, focused moving forward to do it the best way that they can. But there has not been a, there has not been a date that's put on. There has not been a, hey, let's get this done. This time or that time. Another question has just come in. Has anything changed about the way we report and write because of the pandemic and its effect on the court? Well, I mean, to be stating the obvious, the number of times, the number of stories I've written in recent months that include the word that do not include the words coronavirus and or COVID-19, I could probably count on both hands, maybe one hand. Yeah, I mean, I'm working from home. I have worked out, in Troy. I've written from my car. In fairness, those are things, we do sometimes anyway. I covered the Nexium case. I covered both of the cases of Alan Calleros and the Joe Prococo trial. And at times in those cases, I was filing my stories from a pizza place across the street. That's just the way, things are in the modern era. Sometimes, you're not always in the newsroom. Years ago, people would call in their stories and, people would would then take the notes and they'd call it in. So it's always the situation where you have to do your job in the situation that you have. Yeah, it's not. Is it something that completely affects the job? Yeah, because what you're covering is not the same, and your ability to do it is not the same. But I think for us, it's more about, how do we cover the story is always going to be, something that we write, whether it's on a cell phone, whether it's in my living room, whether it's in, a newsroom. So yeah, it affects the where you do it is changed. But at the end of the day, when you're writing a story, there were stories, it's really not much of a difference there. It's not something that I think people who who are looking to see what has changed a lot because of the pandemic. There's a lot that's changed as far as, when you personally think of where you're going. You may say, for instance, if you're going into a courthouse, I want to make sure. I'd be lying to you if I didn't tell you that I didn't use the hand sanitizer in the Rensselaer County Courthouse probably like dozens of times a day. I would be constantly washing my hands over and over again, because you're in a courtroom. When people come and talk to you, there's a little bit more of okay, let me step back a little bit, because there is this social distancing. So it affects you in that respect. But at the end of the day, the job, how I do it, is exactly the same. We still call people the same way when we were reaching them on their cell phone as opposed to their office. But there's also been, I think it's because we're all sort of in the same boat. I think that has affected everybody, and everyone's sort of aware of that. In some respects, people are a little nicer, and then maybe they normally would be. There's more of an understanding on all grounds that we are sort of in the same boat. We write so much on the court beat about people charged with pretty heinous crimes and a lot of egregious cases, but we also had a pretty nice story to be able to do on the 100th birthday of Jenny Carpinello, who was the mother of two very prominent attorneys in the area. One, former Judge Anthony Carpinello, who was on the appellate division of the Third Department for years, over a dozen years, and his brother George Carpinello, who was highly acclaimed attorney, has represented the New York Yankees in court, and he's just an extremely well-respected attorney who's been nominated for the Court of Appeals several times. And she turned 100, and it was gave me an opportunity to talk to the many lives she had touched while working her way up through the court. Through her job at Albany Law School as sort of the mother of Albany Law School, so to speak, someone who had been a waitress raising two kids as a single mom, and it ended up helping out all these people, including Richard Parsons, who was the former CEO of Time Warner. So, I got to speak to him and a number of people whose lives she had touched. So I mean, that was kind of cool. And then, to be able to write a positive story like that, I think was fun for the people to be able to speak. And so it's not all negative. But the fact of the matter is, the news doesn't always change, in that there are still arraignments, there are still cases. We had a judge who was censored, Judge William Carter, for a phone call he made back a few years ago during a murder case, which they felt it was an ex parte, which is which is something that typically would help one side. This case, they said it's not something he should have done, but he was censored by the Commission on Judicial Conduct. That was a story that came out, which I wrote about. So there's been things happening that affect judges, that affect lawyers. I've stayed on top of the cases that I've been covering. And there's also an election this year too. I mean, in case if you didn't have enough stuff to think about in the legal world, David Soros has an opponent. I just wrote a story that's going to run today online on how his opponent, Matthew Toporowski, is proposing a restorative justice program, which is interesting because he's proposing a multifaceted restorative justice program. Now, David Soares, I'm sure, will tell you that they have a restorative justice program. So it's sort of a knock on the current DA to say, hey, look, we're going to establish something, which, by the way, you've been touting for a couple of years. So that'll be certainly a race to continue to watch. But like many things, everything has taken a backseat to the coronavirus, and rightfully so. I mean, this is something that has affected many, many, many people, and and it's going to continue. Let's see if anybody has any other questions here. If not, I'd be more than happy to thank everybody for their time. Hopefully, if people have questions about the law, it can be complicated. There are a lot of times I think people will get a lot of their information. They'll say, I saw this on Law and Order, or I saw this on TV. And that's really, unfortunately, that's not the way the law works. One thing I will mention before I go is there's been the COVID-19, we did a story just yesterday on this. The Dean of Albany Law School, Alicia Ouellette, who's her specialty over the years has been bioethics, obviously, in the law. She's going to be teaching a class in COVID-19 law and the many, many ways it affects the law this summer, really this spring, really, for students at the law school. So it's not only affected our lives, it's not only affected the courts, but it's also affecting, the law being taught to prospective lawyers. So that was pretty interesting as well. But in the meantime, I want to, I don't think we have any more questions, but hey, I want to thank everybody for listening. Hopefully I was helpful. Stay safe, and feel free to email me, rgavin@timesunion.com. I'm on Twitter, Rob Gavin TU, and thank you for watching, and thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and hopefully